When I was younger, I went to the local elementary and middle school. I lived just down the street, about 10 minutes walk, so me and my younger sister would walk to school nearly every day, unless it was very cold outside. One morning, me and my sister had just started our walk when a taxi driver pulled up to us and stopped, which isn't too weird since people in our area tend to travel a lot and use taxis to get to and from the airport, so we would see them quite often. He rolled down his passenger window and asked us if we knew a certain address, which was just down the street, so I pointed him in the right direction. He drove off towards the house, but then when he got close to the house, he turned around completely and came back in our direction and turned around beside us again. I was quite confused as to what he was doing at this point as he pulled up beside us again. He again rolled down his window, but this time he said something along the lines of, "You kids look really tired. You should get in, and I'll drive you to school," in a really persistent tone. But I told him we were good, as we just went to school just down the road. There are a few schools down this street, and I wasn't specific to as which one we went to. After that, he parked his car to get on his phone. At this point, I kinda got the creeps, as he was just sitting there on his phone, staring at me and my sister as we kept walking. After we made it about 30 feet, the cab driver started up again and drove up to us, keeping a slow pace and staring at us with his window down, but didn't say anything. My sister started to freak out really bad at this point, and I was trying my best to handle her and the situation by telling her to ignore him and keep walking. He kept his pace and stare nearly the whole rest of the way as we walked to school, even after my sister started to cry. When we were about a minute away from school, he drove away fast as hell, and in this time, I caught his cab number and company, but missed the license plate. I went straight to the office and told them what had happened, and gave them the information of the cab. After school, one of the education assistants was assigned to walk us home, as they were worried of a repeated incident, and that was all we were told at this point. My mother later told us what really happened. After I reported the incident to the school informed my mother, who called the cab company, filing a complaint against them and the driver. The scariest part is, the number we gave them wasn't even a registered number in their system, and that they had been getting complaints around that time of similar incidents with that number. They never caught the guy from what I understand, but he did have a pretty convincing fake taxi, and who knows what he was doing to people who got into it. Me and my sister weren't allowed to walk to or from school for a while after that. We had to walk in groups with our neighborhood kids, or get a ride from our parents. Number 2. This happened in the early 90s, when my mother was around 20 years old, just 2 years before I was born. One night, my mom and her friends were partying the night away in the suburbs of London, where they lived. When they decided to call it a night, they all jumped in a blue taxi, which was a low-end Mercedes. My mom, being the last stop, was gonna be dropped off last. So after her last friend was dropped off, she was thrilled to finally be able to go home. On the journey back, the taxi driver took her in a totally different route. My mom, thinking that it was nothing, tried to stay calm, and obviously being drunk, didn't worry too much. This is where things got weird. She was on the other side of the town when she started getting really nervous, driving down a quiet country lane. She asked the driver if he was sure where they were going, hoping that he just got confused, but he didn't reply. He drove into a field down the remote road, which was covered with trees and could barely fit one car. Driving onto the field, my mom could see what looked like a small brown hut in the middle of the field. She made a quick decision. She decided she was going to jump out of the taxi and make a run for it, even if he was going pretty fast. And she eventually plucked up the courage to jump out. As she jumped out, she twisted her ankle, making her vulnerable to move. The taxi driver, obviously startled and worried of what had just occurred, turned his car around and started driving in my mom's direction. Noticing that he was coming at her, and her ankle was bad, she thought to herself, "This is finally it." But she moved just enough for her leg to get driven over, and popped the bone out of her skin and her thigh. She was very lucky it wasn't any higher on her. The taxi driver, in a quick fashion, got out of there as fast as possible. My mom, in a huge amount of pain and fearing for her life, bravely decided to get out of there as quickly as possible, walking half a mile with a bone popped out of her thigh. She got to a road and knocked on a stranger's door, and they helped her out and took her to the hospital. The police were informed and visited the site where this dreadful occurrence had happened. The brown hut had nothing in it but a dirty bed, and that was all. The driver was never caught, at least from what we know, and my mom made a very lucky escape through being strong and brave.
Number 3.
Me and my sisters, of which I have 3, grew up in a smallish country town in rural Australia. As you could probably imagine, there was not a lot going on there, and one by one, we jumped ship and moved to greener pastures. In this instance, bigger, more exciting cities. This story is not mine. It's my youngest sister's. When it came time for her to follow suit and move out, she followed the rest of us to Sydney. At the time this story takes place, she was 19 years old. At her first work Christmas party, not long after she'd arrived in town, she got slightly intoxicated, and not knowing the city very well, opted to pay for a taxi in order to get home safely. She left the party, flagged one down, jumped in the front seat next to the driver, advised her destination, and began making polite conversation. As she tells it, the driver was fine at first, but before too long, he began turning the conversation to her looks and her job, telling her that she was gorgeous and asking if she did any modeling. She laughed it off and told him no. It was at this point that while driving the taxi, he reached underneath her seat, pulled out a camera, and started taking her photo. His compliments grew increasingly cruder, and she asked him repeatedly to stop taking her picture before getting angry and yelling at him to stop the taxi and let her out, which he would not do. Thinking quickly, she looked ahead to see if there were any red lights coming up, where he would have to stop the car. Luckily, there was one fast approaching. The driver slowed down, gradually, rather than driving to the lights and stopping, all the while continuing to take her photo. When he was finally moving slow enough that she felt she could exit the car without injuring herself, she opened the door and jumped out. He was moving slowly enough at this point that thankfully she was not injured. Drunk, scared, and lost, she sat in the gutter briefly to collect herself before coming to the realization that she had no clue where she was. She would have to get in another taxi in order to get home. Reluctantly, she flagged down another car, this time getting in the back seat and once again advising her destination. The driver of the second car saw that she'd been crying and was visibly shaken up, and asked her what had happened and if she was all right. She explained the events. The second driver paused for a moment before informing her that the first driver had been taking her in the complete opposite direction of where she had told him she needed to go. Attempts were made to find out who this guy was and report him. However, as my sister was drunk and new to the city, was not able to provide enough specific information, location, exact time, taxi company, description of driver. Since this incident, whenever she has no other option but to get in a taxi to get home, the first thing she does after getting in the car is take a photo of the driver's license with her phone. It makes my skin crawl to think that the guy who did this is more than likely still driving taxis in Sydney, and that this is heralded by the safest way to get home if you're a young woman and it's late at night.